And thank you, Reverend Keith. As some of you know, uh, this is part 2 of a 3-part sermon on humility. The first one was on humility and the ego, and I'll review some of that. For quite some time, I've been interested in the topic of humility and how we exhibit it and how we always need to be in humility to learn. So I'll start with some basics. Humility is a quality of being humble. That's easy. The dictionary defines humility as low self-regard or a sense of unworthiness. But we know that's not right. In a religious context, humility can mean a recognition of self in relation to God, with freedom from pride and arrogance. So I like to go with that one. And as I did in my last sermon, arrogance and pride are the ego. So according to A Course in Miracles, the ego is idolatry, the sign of limited and separated self, born in a body, doomed to suffer and end its life in death. It's very horrid. But of the ego, you can do nothing to save yourself or others, but your spirit can do everything for the salvation of both. Humility is a lesson for the ego, not the spirit. Spirit is beyond humility because it recognizes its radiance and gladly sheds its light everywhere. The meek shall inherit the earth because the egos are humble. This gives them a truer perception. So we'll state for now that the ego in this context was a battle of the self. Okay? Today, I'd like to talk about the next step in humility, and that's empathy. Empathy is the ability to understand and share the feelings of another. Now we're going to go outside the self. In the song we heard, even though it was a lot of fun, he's talking about getting out of the ego and understanding humility and that others have a point of view and a thought also. And we saw empathy this morning already. Reverend David was ill. Reverend Keith could empathize and step up. With ourselves in humility and with others in our empathy. In a book by Carly Fiorina's, Find Your Way, she talks about empathy in all aspects of your life. To practice humility and empathy, we must be outside the bounds of ourselves first, and then outside our little tribes, our little pockets of our lives, our friends, our church, our community. Get outside because we want to be, it's easier to be with who we know and who we are attracted to and what's easy. She says, if we want to make a difference, we must approach and engage with people who think, look, and act differently. We must approach and engage with people who think. We must be willing to say that the world at large, I recognize I don't have all the answers. That's humility. I don't know all the answers. And the second part of that is I acknowledge you can help me fill in those gaps. That's empathy. Humility is the understanding that we can't do it alone. Empathy is the ability to identify with the challenges that have brought other people to where they are. You go with your strengths and you understand others have other strengths. Combined, these two traits invite us to authentic relationships with others, allowing collaborative energy to begin to flow. Humility keeps us open to new information, new insights, new wisdom. Empathy encourages us to unite. So let's look at humility a little bit more. Carly also stated that humility, to be humble, is teachable. We can be teachable. We can learn in our state of humility. The last couple of months have brought this to me more brightly. In May, my mother blacked out and fell on the top of her head. Don't know how, but she fell on the top of her head. She went to the hospital and then to a nursing rehab for a broken wrist, which she also sustained in that fall. She went back to her apartment in assisted living. 4 days later, she was back in the hospital, confused. She didn't know where she was, what she was doing. The head injury was more severe than we believed. All of a sudden, she was not the woman I grew up with. My mother was controlling. She was the one that everybody had to listen to and obey. She was stern in her demeanor and did not believe in her own happiness. She just smiled all the time. I had to get a power of attorney and was terrified because I still saw her as who she was and that she would not relinquish control. I battled my ego, saying I knew what was best for her by taking over her life. And it came back at me that I was working in my ego. But I am teachable. I knew I could not do it myself. I stepped back in humility. I asked for help from those that could be empathetic or that understood. My husband helped me with clearing the house. There really wasn't that much left, but it was just a matter of packing stuff up and relinquishing, letting stuff go. A lot of it was her personal things I thought she might need in her apartment, but obviously she didn't. My friend Bridget had gone through this with her mother. Her mother had had dementia, and Bridget had to step in and take control. My friend Cheryl had a wonderful husband who suffered from dementia also, and she helped. They were strong and they had empathy, and I let them in. Come to find out, my mother has a traumatic brain injury. She's not herself. Everyone at the rehab center said, "Oh, she's so nice and sweet. She listens and she's just so wonderful to work with." And I went, "That's not my mother." But she signed the power of attorney because down deep she knew something wasn't right. She came home to a cleaner apartment. She has a hoarding issue. But with Bridget and Cheryl, my husband's and my friends' help, their humility opened me to empathize with them and what they have gone through. I understood. Also from A Course in Miracles, it says, when we have become willing to hide nothing, you will not only be willing to enter into communion, but will also understand peace and joy. And I'm working on that now. Back to Carly's book. If you've ever articulated your position on a topic or whom you were speaking and you said, "I understand what you're saying," That's empathy. When you've said, I've been there too, that's empathy. That's coming outside of yourself. Or you say something to someone even though you don't totally believe their ideas. I appreciate your perspective. That's empathy. And research professor Brené Brown, who has wonderful books, she says, empathy is a choice. It's a vulnerable choice. In order to connect with you, I have to connect with something inside myself that knows that feeling. How difficult is it to sometimes to let go of your ego and be vulnerable? To truly open and not hide. Sit in your humility. I found 9 qualities that I've worked with from Thrive Global that have a positive impact on how you can lead a life with humility, minus the ego, but with the empathy. So we'll start with empathy. It's a feeling with others, not for others. That's sympathy. We can be tuned into the smaller, everyday ways we can feel with others, like considering how people may or may not perceive our actions, and listening to understand, not just respond. Ask yourself, do you have an understanding of how the people that you interact with listen? There are multiple ways to develop new conversational and learning styles, more than you know. Number 2 would be, as I said, vulnerability. There's a broader culture that doesn't use vulnerability, that doesn't want to admit to it. It can lead to a lack of innovation, a lack of stepping outside yourself, that frees yourself for creativity. Three and 4 are patience and curiosity, and that I love. The people I nannied for, they're just amazed at how patient I can be with the 3-year-old sitting there eating lunch for an hour, just sitting there waiting. But they do finish eating. It just takes a long time between talking and looking at this and looking at that. They're just so curious, and I love it. 5 is humility. When we're caught up in a culture of self-promotion, it can be less present than recognizing and rewarding the celebration of your strengths. Great leaders seek to serve others, and when good things happen, they openly share credit, and they feel passionate about the differences they're making. 6 is inclusiveness. Deliberately seeking perspectives, as I talked about earlier, from those who have good reason to disagree with you, think different thoughts, or just be a different work ethic. Allow new ideas to be heard. Live without fear or reprehension. Inclusiveness is also about open listening. As I say to my kids, do you have your listening ears on? Effective listening means paying whole body attention to another person, making eye contact, and simply asking questions and responding without judgment. 8 is kindness. I like being kind. I ask my kids all the time, was that kind and nice? No? Okay. Let's not do that again. It's less grand gestures and more about putting the incremental time and effort into making sure you're open and abundant with how you show up for people around you. 9, I think one of the most important ones is balance. Like a set of scales, we have to balance our time and energy so they're in harmony. The snowballing effect of our busy culture is that we feel exhausted, aggravated, and in many cases, irritated. We lose the ability to be mindful in the present moment. Instead, treat your balance like you would any other non-negotiable item in your calendar. Schedule it in. I schedule time in some days when they're really busy. I'll put a little note. Because in order to lead well, we must also be well. And as we are all students of God, we're teachers of God, and we're leaders of God. Thank you, and have a great day.
Thank you, Lisa.